From box breathing and physiological size to mouth taping and Tumo meditation, there's no shortage of breathing techniques that claim to improve human performance, but how many of them are actually supported by evidence?
One common breathing technique that's taught in tactical settings is box breathing or tactical breathing. But there wasn't actually any empirical research behind it. And when I asked a lot of individuals whether or not they were using these techniques, the answer was no.
In this episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast, I'm joined by Dylan McKay, former New Zealand Army officer and Special Forces Bomb Disposal Commander. Dylan has dedicated his career to understanding what the evidence really tells us about breathing and performance.
We've got to be careful of these bumper sticker taglines that people latch onto, because effectively what it is it's a belief system. Think about, how have I already learned to breathe in a specific context? And then you can start to learn how to disengage that habit.
Hi, Dylan. Welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. How are you?
Good, thanks, Martin. Appreciate you inviting me on, mate. It's good to be here.
It's absolutely my pleasure. This has been a long time coming. We've had this in the books for a while, so it's good to finally get it recorded.
Too right. I agree. Yeah.
Can I throw it straight over to you? Can you tell us who you are, what you do, and the reason why I've invited you on today?
Sure. So I'm ex-military. I used to be a New Zealand Army officer, and I spent 12 years serving in the New Zealand Army. Most of that was as an EOD Commander with the New Zealand Special Forces. So I'm an ATO by trade, or an ammunition technical officer. And then about 4 years ago, Martin, as you know, I left and I moved to the UK with my family, and I set up my business called Render Safe. And so we effectively set that up so that we could train back into the bomb disposal community. But a big part of that was bringing in the human performance work that I had started in the unit when I was the HP lead. And a lot of that was centered around understanding breathing behavior and understanding it as a potential enhancement for performance and also a limiter for performance. Hence why we're going to be talking a lot about breathing today, and hopefully explore some of the myths and some of the questions that we still have.
Yeah, we definitely will. There's going to be some rabbit holes. I feel like we're going to be diving down into. Can we go back to your old world very quickly? In the bomb disposal world, when I always picture, having seen films like The Hurt Locker, you know, all that kind of stuff, that my imagination goes wild about what an EOD officer is doing and bomb disposal and what have you. But the main thing that comes across to me is pressure. You know, it is in some respects a life and death decision that you're making. Can you tell me about what that is like? What's the pressure like of those sorts of activities?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that depends on big time is your experience and how much training you have. And one of the things that I'm really grateful for is the training that I've had is pretty top level training. So I trained in the UK, for example, where ammunition technical officers have had decades and decades of operational experience to learn principles and philosophies that have been embedded into the EOD community that allow us to operate safely and adequately and actually reduce and mitigate that risk that's inherent when you're dealing with improvised explosive devices or even just unexploded ordnance. And so it's twofold. I think a lot of the pressure is self-induced. I think that most of the time we fail for two primary reasons. Either we haven't got the cognitive skills and we haven't developed them yet, and that might be the way we think about a threat assessment, for example, and we need to develop that particular skill, or it is that individual isn't prepared for the anxiety that they're experiencing in that situation. So for me, that comes down to how much experience do you have, how much training do you have, and how do you self-regulate in those moments to allow you to use your cognition to the best effect to achieve the outcome. So yeah, I think those are the two main things that come to mind.
Yeah. In terms of that self-regulation piece, and let's get going. Let's get into it. I know that you're an expert in one particular area in terms of like breathing and how breathing behavior is involved in this kind of stuff. So under those pressure situations, what happens to breathing?
Okay, great question. So the first thing to understand is that actually it's highly individualized. So I would look at, let's shift our paradigm quickly rather than just assuming that breathing will change under stress. Let's start with a slightly different paradigm. let's look at breathing through a behavioural lens for a moment. And what I mean by that is let's understand breathing as something that is motivated, something that has an outcome to it. So it may have a reinforcement based on that outcome. That outcome could be functional, it could be dysfunctional, it could be optimal, depending on how we define that outcome. But also it means that there are belief systems that are centered around that particular breathing behavior in that context. And the reason I say that is that if we only look at breathing as a mechanical function or something that is responsive to stress in a very specific way, i.e., someone has a stress response and breathing rate increases, and we can say that's subject to the autonomic nervous system, we actually miss all of that individuality. And I think that it's problematic when we start to get to interventions because we end up simplifying those interventions. And in my experience, human performance is anything but simple. It's highly individualized and consistently creates more questions for me than I get answers. So I think to go back and to your initial question, how does breathing change in response to stress? Well, if you look at the literature, there is an individualized response to that stressor, and it's specific. And it doesn't mean that breathing will change in a dysfunctional way. It might be completely functional. In fact, we let's think about it in terms of a fight or flight system. Saber-toothed tiger walks in. I need to be able to either run or fight. I want my system to respond in a way that allows respiratory rate to increase, heart rate to increase, because I know I'm going to be using my metabolism. So that's an adaptive response. But how the individual reacts could be at odds with what the outcome wants to be, or what the outcome should be in terms of an adaptive response. It could be a maladaptive response. So that's where it gets nuanced, and hopefully we're going to unpick some of these things today.
We will. Yeah. Before we really get into the weeds, I'm interested in your journey into breathing as a pillar of performance, as a component of performance. I'm a sports scientist by background. I know you've done your studies as well. When we look at human performance, it's typically physical training, it's nutrition, it's psychology, it's sleep. Breathing is often there or thereabouts. It gets lobbed in somewhere, but it's rarely the core components of a lot of the programs that I've been involved in, at least. I'm interested in why breathing for you, like when you were doing that job, assuming that, I don't know what the background to where it came from, but essentially why breathing? Why did you go in such a deep dive into this area? What was it about that area of science and HP practice that really pulled you in?
Yeah, it actually started when we were reviewing the whole human performance system, and we were kind of looking at all the pillars as you've just identified, Martin. And one of the pillars that kept coming up, which was part of psychology, was breathing, and in particular these breathing techniques that we were taught. One common breathing technique that's taught in tactical settings is box breathing or tactical breathing. So this is probably, we're talking 10 years ago. In fact, exactly 10 years ago when I started to look into this area. And two things were quite interesting to me. One was that all of it was anecdotal research. So there wasn't actually any empirical research behind it, which doesn't mean that it doesn't have efficacy or practical application, but I found that pretty interesting considering it was like promulgated pretty widely. And then you do a bit of an acid test and you say, who's using this in the unit? And when I asked a lot of individuals whether or not they were using these techniques, the answer was no. So those two things are at odds really with why we're teaching something that's either not being used and doesn't have the real evidence base behind it. So that really led me on I almost think of it like a quest now. And actually an old lecturer of mine, Martin, used to say that education is just a series of disintegrating lies. And breathing has proved that to me. So I've been on a bit of a quest ever since to sort of understand what's going on and why it matters to us in these performance environments.
Yeah. Box breathing's an interesting one. I think just to like go on a slight deviation. You're right, it's everywhere. Like I've seen it. I've taught it. I have used it. It wasn't until I started talking to you that I kind of stopped for a second and thought, hang on a minute, yeah, Dylan's right. There's where's this come from? And I think I've picked it up through, I think, is it Lieutenant Colonel Grossman's book
on combat.
On combat, yeah. It's in there. He talks about that, or around this technique, this tactical breathing technique. But yeah, you're right. I've struggled to find. There's the odd paper. There's one that's just been published recently. There's definitely a lot more anecdote in it than there seems to be real strong evidence base to it.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the other thing we always have to consider is, are we looking at these things in a high fidelity, ecologically valid context for the performance environment that we tend to discuss in extremist environments, right? Because I think there is a difference between health and performance. And although we would like to have both of them aligned, when we're looking at breathing behavior within the context of performance, we really have to get down to what is the performance, what is operation readiness, how are we defining it? And then we have to test these breathing interventions within that context. So we start understanding, is it something that actually works for everybody? My hypothesis would be, no, it absolutely probably won't. And in fact, some breathing techniques will probably make it worse for individuals. So I think we need to step into a new paradigm where we accept we don't know everything yet, and there's a lot more work to be done. And I think that a lot of the studies that have been done in recent years are on the right path, but we just need that. We need more ecological validity for the performance context that we work in.
Yeah. I've had an experience of somebody who, when they attempted box breathing in particular, and anyone who's never heard of box breathing, it's basically you inhale, you hold your breath, you exhale, you hold your breath. That's the box. I had someone who had never really practiced any of this stuff before. They tried doing box breathing, and it made them really panicky. The main thing that they got out of it was just this overwhelming sense of panic. And they were just saying that, that holding the breath, whether they'd had some kind of, I don't know, underwater issue or something where they had to hold their breath for a long time, and it brought back memories, who knows. But they really panicked. They did one box and they were like, I'm stopping this, didn't like it. So I think I've definitely seen some people who really do not respond well to this sort of stuff, just from in my own experience. There must be more, I assume.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful example of understanding breathing through a behavioral lens, because for that particular individual, it'd be interesting to know what their belief system is around it, what part of that particular breathing technique causes them to have that emotional connection to it, or that memory, or that cognitive thought. And I think that speaks to why the psychology of breathing is just as important as the physiology of breathing. And if we don't understand the two together, we can assume that just by manipulating mechanics, you're going to get a positive outcome.
The psychology is always the most important. I always tell people this.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. Yes, yeah. I mean, the black box of our minds is a difficult one to unravel, but I think once we start looking at things with better questions, we get more information, if assuming we've got trust with that individual or that team that we're working with. And I think that's where I'd like to see this go, is a little bit more emphasis on asking better questions and the coaching and the understanding the behavior. Why is that individual responding negatively versus another individual?
Yeah. There's other breathing techniques that I want to get your opinion on. But before I do that, you mentioned this dichotomy of functional versus dysfunctional breathing. And functional makes sense. It's aligned to, like, if it is part of the autonomic nervous system, it's not necessarily conscious. It's it's just in reaction to a stressor, and there's a function to it. In that case, helping you run away to fight. What do you mean by dysfunctional breathing? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, dysfunctional breathing has to be defined by the outcome. So here's an example. Let's look at a simple context. So someone doing weightlifting in the gym who uses a Valsalva maneuver. Now, that could be a highly functional breathing intervention or breathing technique to use to lift a heavy weight. Now, if that individual was doing a full Valsalva, lifting heavy weight in another context where they had to use their cognition after that fact, potentially the increase in blood pressure and the increase in intra-abdominal pressure and what happens to physiology could lead to a dysfunctional cognitive outcome. So in both those contexts, one is functional and one could be potentially dysfunctional, but it's effectively the same breathing technique or breathing intervention.
Yeah, just a breath hold. A Valsalva is just a breath hold, isn't it, basically?
That's right. It's just a breath hold. You're just creating pressure to make sure that you have the stability of the spine protected. Another example would be how do we define dysfunction in terms of the physiological mechanism? And one way we can do that is we can measure gas exchange. So a lot of practitioners focus solely on mechanics of breathing, right? So if we look at respiration, we actually go, okay, there's internal respiration, there's external respiration, which is breathing mechanics, and there's cellular respiration, which is ATP, cellular, mitochondrial function, all of that stuff that's happening completely subconsciously. So if we look at internal respiration, which is gas exchange, we can then identify what dysfunctional breathing looks like. And that could be, for example, a ventilation perfusion mismatch. If we were measuring it with a metabolic cart, so like a CPET gold standard metabolic cart. I use things like educational capnography in some of the work I do, which measures a thing called end-tidal carbon dioxide. So I can look at when someone's over-breathing, which we would define as dysfunctional because they're breathing out too much carbon dioxide. So I think the key is that you have to define it based on the outcome and the context that you're in, rather than just saying one breathing technique is functional and dysfunctional, or how do we define that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go into a few techniques. I want to just go through, do a little bit of myth busting. See what I'm going to throw some labels out there and see what you make of them. Here's the hand grenade question for you, Dylan.
Fantastic.
I've read a few books on breathwork, and I get spammed all the time on Instagram. So we'll go through a few different ones.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about the physiological sigh? What is that, and is that going to be something that was going to help somebody?
Okay, so my understanding of the physiological sigh is the first thing is that we sigh naturally already. And I've seen some studies suggesting that it's like every 5 minutes or so, we just do a normal sigh or a natural physiological sigh. So manipulating that consciously, so taking what is already a reflex, already happened naturally, and then making it a conscious intervention. The idea is that it's creating an affect. It's a subjective change for that individual. Right, so it's supposed to reduce stress in that moment, because all of the studies that I've seen on physiological sigh are to do with stress management. Now, all of us could do it right now. So a physiological sigh, as in the literature, is a double inhale and a slower, longer exhale, that kind of feeling. Now, that might provide a subjective positive affect for that individual, right? And there's no arguing that could be a positive thing in any given moment that they're experiencing stress. But as I always want us to look at is the behavioral stuff. So is the mechanics of breathing changing? How is that changing respiration, or how is that impacting that person's not only perception but also respiration? Because if we couple those two things, it could actually be making respiration worse, but that person has a positive affect associated with that breathing technique. Now, that can be problematic, not all the time, but it can be problematic in developing false beliefs. So the idea that if I manipulate my breathing, if I control my breathing in this way, I'm going to get a positive outcome, without realizing that actually the symptoms that person might be experiencing are because of their internal respiratory compromise, which could be, for example, overbreathing, like we talked about, which is when you're reducing CO2 by exhaling too much CO2. So I've seen that a lot because it's a belief system, Martin. that person ends up believing that that technique is giving them a positive advantage, and that's great, but we don't know necessarily how that individual is responding from a respiratory perspective.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. I worked with a police officer who's a counter-terrorist specialised firearms officer recently, and we provide education to them, and similar to what we're talking about here. And what I normally do is I ask someone to come up and I put them onto a capnograph, an educational capnograph, so that we can see their end-tidal CO2 in real time. And for anyone that has never used capnography before, has no idea what it is, it's a nasal cannula that's able to measure what is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the lung, so what's maintained at the lung, but I'm measuring it at the end of your exhale. So it's indicative of what's going on in the blood, basically, if in a healthy individual. Now, that police officer, when I asked him to come up, was actually over breathing. And we know that because we can see that there's an individual, let's say, trend range that I look for. I don't treat them as clinical ranges. I treat them as trend ranges. So I want to know what their baseline is and where they sit. And CO2 kept dropping. And it settled at about 25 millimeters of mercury on this capnograph. And I asked him to use breathing techniques that he was familiar with and that he believed in, and none of them worked. In fact, he actually got more hypocapnic, or too little CO2 is what we refer to that as. And no matter what he did, he could not regulate himself from a carbon dioxide perspective. And I was using that to show him that just because you manipulate breathing mechanics doesn't mean that it optimizes respiration. So we have to look at the two together. How does breathing mechanics and respiratory chemistry align? And when we manipulate mechanics only with assuming it's going to change respiration, that's not always the outcome. So what we ended up having to do is we had to change the stimulus control. And so I actually asked him to do some exercise. I asked him to do some air squats. And within 10 seconds, he was back to 45 millimeters of mercury on the capnograph, because I changed the stimulus control at that point, if you like.
Mm.
For him, that was a great opportunity to get some insight into these belief systems that we're talking about, because subsequently what we've done is we've worked together to identify where those belief systems came from. And a lot of it is about what people believe good breathing looks like.
Yeah.
So to go back,
probably from a human performance practitioner came in and taught them something that maybe was not right.
And this is a long way around to say the physiological sigh is a mechanical conscious breathing intervention that could provide you with a subjective change that's positive. But we also don't necessarily know how that's impacting respiration and what belief systems come with that and how that could perpetuate dysfunctional breathing. So it's tricky, right? It's really individualized. Yeah.
I remember when we were together and you did a demonstration on two people, basically the same size, same height. Let's call them Shane and John because that was their names. No. If you remember doing that.
Yeah.
Same size blokes, similar professions, and you did the same technique, and on the capnographer, we saw a completely different trend. Remember, one of them plummeted; their CO2 dropped like a stone, and the others stayed relatively stable.
Yes.
And they both subjectively experienced fairly similar things, didn't they? They both said it felt the same, but the data showed one was dysfunctional, it wasn't working for him in the way he thought it was going to, and the other was fine.
Yeah, and that's another perfect example. Because the one that we would classify as dysfunctional, so the individual that thinks that breathing behavior or breathing technique is supporting them, we can then start to identify what belief systems are behind that. And I think that opens up a different frontier, because now we can identify those faulty beliefs. We can quite quickly change them if the person has good self-awareness, which a lot of these guys do, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing we also need to consider is hypocapnia or over-breathing provides us a state change, Martin. And I know you understand state-dependent learning very well, but you're actually potentially accessing a different state by overbreathing. Now that adds a whole different paradigm to what we're talking about, because that might actually have a payoff for that individual. It might be a solution for that individual. And so we're looking at it going, well, it's adaptive in that sense, but they don't understand how it's impacting their respiration. And so a lot of the symptoms that they might be experiencing because of the compromised internal respiration or the hypocapnia, they might be attributing those to other things. And now we end up in this really interesting situation where the person's got the belief system, they're attributing the symptoms to something external, and they're not realizing that the problem all along is the way that they're breathing.
Mm. These belief systems, I think, where they come from, there could be many places, but there are a lot of books out at the moment about breath work, and there's lots, as I say, you go onto YouTube. Well, I think me, at least, I get spammed by this stuff because that's, a human performance guy gets a human performance spam, I suppose. There are books, no need to name them. We've talked about this, and there seems to be a bit of nonsense around it, but people do buy these books, they read it. I mean, going down the myths, another one that I think is really prevalent is nasal breathing. I've seen people who they're going for a run and they refuse to breathe in through their mouth. It's just, nasal breathing will make me fitter. It's that belief that it's going to get them fitter. Equally, in my world, people tape their mouth when they go to sleep because apparently it makes we are meant to be nasal breathers. We breathe better through our nose. Is there any truth in any of that?
Yeah, so this is a great one. And do you know what? In some of the sports science stuff, there's some really good researchers who are starting to look at this. People like Eric Harbour, I recommend looking at some of his stuff. Let's start by saying respiration or internal respiration, so gas exchange, isn't necessarily correlated with which orifice you breathe from. So I could be breathing in the nose or the mouth, and my respiration could be perfect.
Or breathing through your ass if you're going through a particular.
Or breathing through ours, exactly. Yeah, which most people listen to this will have their own experiences about what that means to them. But yeah, exactly. And I just think that point alone is like, okay, so if it's not to do with the orifice in which I breathe from, but also we might see, say, for example, a connection between someone mouth breathing and over breathing. If we're measuring it, we might see that. I think that trying to breathe in the nose at 100% of VO2 max will cause some challenges for people trying to do that, particularly because of the Venturi effect. You think about getting air through a tiny orifice. There is going to be potentially a lot of turbulence from that, which could cause significant dyspnea or discomfort in breathing. So I think let's go back to the first principles, right? It's like, what is the context of the breathing behavior? Are we talking about high ventilation when we're under exertion? Are we talking about at rest? Because at rest, I don't believe we should be breathing through the mouth. I don't think that we were evolutionarily designed to breathe through the mouth at rest. And I think you would be able to look at that and ask, why is that person breathing in the mouth at rest? What is it about that behavior that they've established? What's motivating it? Why have they established that behavior? What is the outcome of it? Because a lot of the time we do see dysfunction caused from that.
Could it be structural, like someone who's, their teeth, for example, their jaw structure? Is that a component? So they're just mouth breathers because of a structural problem?
I think they combine. So there's a whole area of the science called functional airway management or functional airway functional airway management. And the idea is, again, over years, our jaws, and I'm one of these people, I've got a slim jaw that my teeth are crowded, for example. That doesn't
You hide it well under the beard, Dylan.
Thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. That's why I wear a beard, so I can hide it. But just because I've got a shorter jawline and crowded teeth, it doesn't mean that I'm going to have compromised respiration. But what does get interesting is when you start to look at the combination of people's responses to things like that. If they feel restriction in their airway because they do have a functional airway problem or disorder, then actually that can have a behavioral impact as well. And so we have to be looking at both. We have to look at what is the functional airway situation and what is the behavioral adaptation or the behavioral response. And I'll give you a really clear example. I worked with a client years ago who could not breathe in the nose. And she had gone through a number of ear, nose, and throat specialists to try and understand what was going on. And she got a lot of she got a lot of people saying to her, "Oh, you need to get this sorted. You're a mouth breather." You know, it was a label. You're a mouth breather. You're breathing through your mouth. We can hear it. A lot of stress from her family. And those ear, nose, and throat specialists, they looked at it from a functional perspective. They went, okay, it's clearly to do with the fact that she can't get enough airflow through her nose. So one of the recommendations is a septorhinoplasty, which is effectively when they shave the turbinates of your nose to try and allow more airflow through the nose. What do you think, Martin, happened the first time she got a septorhinoplasty? Do you think it solved her airway management problem and her mouth breathing problem?
I'm gonna guess a no.
It was a no. It was a no. Now, that brings up something really interesting for us to question is, okay, why? Why? So if the mechanism that they're suggesting, which is the airway management, wasn't the actual problem, then what is the problem? Their recommendation was to do it again. So she had a second septorhinoplasty. And what really struck home with this client and this individual was that actually she got to a point where it got worse because of these interventions. When we looked at it through the behavioral lens, what we really found was actually she was suffering from significant ear hunger and dyspnea every time she went to breathe through her nose. And that mechanism was fear related. So the motivation behind it was the fear of not being able to get enough oxygen, which is a very strong motivator. And the outcome was that she went to the mouth, because if she can't breathe through the nose and she feels like she can get enough air through the mouth, that's a very common switch to make, nose to mouth. Now for her, her goal was to be able to eat steak again, because she couldn't even eat steak because she felt as though she was suffocating. And we did a series of desensitization practices, Martin. So really simple. Imagine for a moment I asked you if you couldn't breathe through the nose because you felt this like horrible air hunger. But I said to you, okay, try breathe through the nose for 30 seconds and just realize that actually that's fear driven. That is your response to thinking you need more air. You don't need more air. You've got more oxygen in your body at any one time than you actually need. So it's not an oxygen deficit that you're experiencing. That is a perception of air hunger. It's a perception that you're not getting enough air. If you can show people that they are getting enough air, and one way you can do that is biofeedback, then all of a sudden their brain can reconcile the belief versus the reality. And then we do what's called negative practice. So you would switch between the nose and the mouth over time, and you would slowly desensitize yourself to that fear of not getting enough oxygen by breathing through the nose. Now, over time, that reduced that sense down to the point where she was able to breathe in the nose. So that
makes sense.
I think there's two ways of looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, that's just how you deal with any phobia, like that behavioral desensitization. It makes sense. Why not be the same for breathing? What about, as I said, the nasal breathing at night? You know, when you are unconscious, people have, the number of people I've had to say to me that they tape their mouth when they're asleep. Now, I've got my own opinions on it. I won't go into them at this point. I'll allow you to tell us what you think before I let loose. What do you think in terms of breathing for the nighttime?
I struggle with this one too. One, I don't think that we have enough evidence for it, and I think that it's one of those also it has a high potential to go wrong, because these individuals who are taping their mouth are probably also not thinking about the fact that they might have sleep apnea, for example, which is obviously clinical. So,
well, that's why most people do it, I think, because they snore so loud, which is an indicator of obstructive sleep apnea. So they then tape their mouth up and potentially make it worse.
Well, exactly. That, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head from my perspective. You're taking a risk, really. If you don't diagnose that particular problem through a medical practitioner who can diagnose it through polysomnograph or something else, then you might actually be making it worse. And again, for every anecdotal experience that someone has where it's a positive, and the same goes for nasal breathing, right? There's plenty of people out there who talk about how important nasal breathing is, and I am one of them in different contexts, but also it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for everybody. And we have to understand that by saying to everybody, oh, you should just tape your mouth and that will solve your sleep problems, there are some huge assumptions there. So I'm not a fan of mouth taping. I don't think we have enough evidence to support it. Yeah. And I think that people should be looking for either clinical sleep solutions, or they should be looking at their breathing during the day and having a think about how that might be impacting sleep.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I have the same opinion. I mean, I think we have talked about it before. It comes down to that belief again. There's the beliefs that people hold. You've got celebrities who are, like footballers as an example, who claim it's, improving their football performance. I'm just not. I'm not convinced. I really am not convinced. I think there's a lot of nonsense. Talking of nonsense. I can't remember if you were with us at this point. We did a walk up Ben Nevis. I don't know if you came on that one, but
no, I don't think.
Anyway, as we got to the top of Ben Nevis, it was cold. It was, we did it. There was ice on the top. It was windy. It was snowy. It was cold. And I'm walking up, and there were two lads from Liverpool, broad Liverpudlian accents, in hiking boots and shorts and nothing else. They were shirtless. They didn't have hats on. It was cold. It was probably in the minus. And I was with a guy at the time who's a Royal Marines mountain leader, and he gave him a bit of a telling off. So, what happens when you go down with hypothermia? And both of them said, they started doing this weird breathing technique. They named an individual, I won't name, just in case he listens to this and sues me, but yeah. a Dutch fella who is a man of ice, should we call him, who likes the cold. He has a breathing technique. And they started doing this weird kind of huffing and puffing, and said, don't worry, we are doing this breathing. But they'd read this book. Apparently it helps them deal with the cold. Have you come across this? I think they call it Tumo meditation, I think is the actual phrase, or the name of what it is. But those sorts of methods, anything in them?
I think we've got to be really careful with these methods. And again, I'm not the kind of person who sits here and goes, we should have double-blind placebo studies for everything before we make a decision about whether or not to use it or not. But I do think that this particular technique lacks evidence in the performance context that we're talking about. But let's talk about mechanism for a moment, because I don't think a lot of listeners really understand some of the physiology that's going on. And I think that it would be important for them to understand the physiology and how psychology can be influenced by that. So if you take, for example, a Tumo breathing technique, which is effectively hyperventilation, but with the intention of over breathing. So even if I instructed you to do it now, here's the first thing. I have no idea whether or not, just because I instruct you to do a mechanical breathing technique, that you're actually having the impact on your physiology that I think you are. So that's number one. I don't know that unless I measure it. You could hyperventilate, but not overbreathe, because hyperventilate just means to increase breathing rate. The connotation is always hyperventilation means that you are like having a panic attack. That's a connotation with it, but it actually just means increased respiratory rate. So that's the first problem. The second challenge I see with this stuff is that people don't understand what they're doing when they actually overbreathe, and they're reducing carbon dioxide significantly. So they're exhaling too much CO2. And what happens is you get cerebral and tissue vasoconstriction, which means you're shutting off blood. It's like a shunt of blood to your brain and also peripheral tissues. Because your Bohr effect, which looks at how does oxygen travel around your body from the alveoli in my lung into the blood on the hemoglobin, and then how does it get off that blood and hop into tissues and provide my tissues and my brain with the oxygenation I need. And the analogy I use is that oxygen and carbon dioxide have to do a handshake And that's critical for our acid-base balance, the way our physiology regulates itself. So if you've exhaled too much CO2, you can't do that handshake anymore because you've created this cerebral vasoconstriction, this vasoconstriction, even bronchoconstriction, for example. People can experience that where airways shut down, they close off. And all of that's happened to your physiology, which from a functional cognitive perspective is not good. But also what happens to a lot of people is they have this emotional disinhibition, where under that different state, they experience a perceived change in cognition, right? And how they interpret that, how they provide meaning to that is their own, based on their own beliefs and their own perception. So some people, it can be a horrific experience, and that emotional disinhibition can bring up past traumas. If they had undiagnosed heart problems, it could cause heart problems. We've seen there's been a number of deaths, for example, around water, whether or not that's to do with heart attacks or whether or not that's to do with passing out from hypoxia and actually drowning. We don't know, but you'd have to dive into some of those individual cases. But once you understand the physiology, you then get a little bit more of an understanding about why would I want to do this and what is it that I'm trying to achieve. And I think that more people should be asking that question as opposed to just assuming that this technique will have the outcome that they think it does.
Those two lads looked cold, I'll tell you that much. It wasn't doing anything for their thermoregulation. They looked cold. Yeah, I do think, you know, like, it comes back to exactly what you're saying. Like, these techniques might be able to change the state, the phenomenology, the lived experience. You feel a certain way, but it's not necessarily one changing a performance outcome that you're interested in. It's not able to do the thing you're trying to change. You just feel different. I think that seems to be really common, I think, in a lot of these different techniques.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And actually, you bring up a really good point. I think we should differentiate between altered states and altered traits, because behavior change takes time. You know, if we could solve every problem with a breathing technique, we wouldn't have any problems. We wouldn't have challenges, but that's just not how behavior works. We learn through experience and specificity of practice and repetition, and it takes time to alter our traits. But these state changes, people seem to be really obsessed with the performance enhancement benefits.
Yeah.
And I think they should focus more on training the skills that they need to perform in those environments.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and I don't want to sound too skeptical, because I do think some of these breathing techniques really, like you've said, they have a time, they have a place for the right person at the right time in the right environment. They can be a really, really useful tool. What I have experienced is the saying, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like, if all you can teach is a specific breathing technique, I've seen practitioners who use it for everything. Yes. And I think my red flag, skepticism red flag goes up a little bit when it's well, this is one technique that you're using for every aspect of every performance, whether it's a physical performance, a cognitive performance, maybe it's a memory task, maybe it's a task switching. I'll do this technique and all these things get better. I always think, that can't be true. Like, it can't be true. And if there's an effect, there's also a side effect, you know, and then we need to consider what are the side effects of these things. You may feel a certain way, but as you've just said, the physiology might not be doing what you think it's doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's made more challenging by a lot of these modern day influences that we're talking about, because it perpetuates these belief systems. You know, unfortunately, the inconvenient truth is what you're saying.
Yeah. Coming back to the capnographer and alternatives. Now, I'd never seen a capnographer until you showed it to me. I'd not seen an educational capnographer, the little unit that you've got. Obviously, I've seen them in hospitals and, you know, people who've got COPD and what have you. I was talking to somebody and they said to me, why don't you just do a Bolt score? Now, the Bolt score is from, again, one of these books. And they were saying, well, you don't need this, because capnographers ain't cheap, are they? Like, ultimately, you know, you're not going to go down to your local electronics shop and buy one. They're not the cheapest piece of equipment. So there was the alternative: do this Bolt score. what's a Bolt score, and what's your thoughts?
Okay, so the Bolt score is effectively a breath hold test, and the supposition of it is that if you, let's say you do an inhale and then you allow yourself to exhale fully, and at the bottom of that exhale you have a breath hold, and the time of that breath hold will be your Bolt score effectively, and that then they're suggesting that then provides you an indication of your CO2 tolerance. Let's look at this again through our more scientific and behavioral lens, because there's a couple of issues with that.
Just a couple.
But one, acid-base physiology just doesn't work that way, right? So we have chemoreceptors in our body and baroreceptors in our body that are constantly looking for changes in pH across all of the 11 systems of our body. It seems pretty incredible what our human physiology does. And I'll have a chat later with you about this trust idea, but physiology is incredibly complex, but it's unbelievably amazing when you really look at it. But from a pH perspective, if we're looking at breathing, pH needs to stay pretty tightly regulated between 7.35 and 7.45. And obviously we go outside of those ranges often depending on what we're doing, like exercise, for example, would take us outside of those ranges and then we recover. But when we're looking at breathing behavior, so we've got reflexes, which are regulating this CO2 at the alveoli and in the blood, and then we've got breathing behavior or habits that can be that can compromise those reflexes. So the two don't necessarily support each other, and so we have to be able to identify which ones, is the breathing habit dysfunctional because it's actually impacting reflexes, or is it supporting the reflexes in the performance context? If we only look at breathing through a Bolt score and we say, oh yeah, you've got that level of CO2 tolerance, there is that misses the whole premise of how the physiology actually works, which it's constantly adapting. You don't have a set point in your CO2 tolerance that exists and then changes. Physiology is always adapting depending on the demands that we're experiencing. So to suggest that score is important for performance, there is no link there. There is no evidence there to support that link. And I think that it fundamentally misunderstands how our physiology really works. And there was I can't remember the author, sorry, Martin, but there was a good study recently which tried to look at Bolt score versus VO2 max, and they found no connection between the two. So it's just, I think people need to understand that it's convenient to want to simplify something down to a score, but that's just not how physiology works. And I think we have to have a greater awareness across our populations, not to just think that, oh, that's really convenient, that technique, that score, if I improve that, I'll get better performance outcomes. That's belief, and those beliefs are faulty a lot of the time, and we need to be a bit more cautious about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve when we don't understand the physiology.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any evidence out there. I'm just pulling out an idea, but I wouldn't. You could almost falsify that belief, because if you've got free divers who have got an amazing breath hold, like that's the nature of their performance. They need to hold their breath for a long time. I think the world record's 20 something minutes. Yes. Half man, half dolphin. If it was true, you'd expect those people would have off the chart VO2 max, and I'd be surprised if they do. I don't know. I don't think.
I've not seen any studies on that.
No.
But I think it's great to look at a specific use case for breath holding and the adaptation that they're looking to make. And what would be great is, imagine, this is the problem, is if we don't measure things, then how do we see them? How do we understand them? And so a lot of the research that's done in these niche fields, like, for example, freediving, we always have to look at the methodological issues, which is that we're not necessarily measuring the totality of that individual's adaptation, which means that we're going to miss things, or we're going to make assumptions about what might be going on. So it would be great to study them and look at what changes in their physiology because they're clearly able to hold their breath for a longer period of time because they've created a training adaptation. But what does that have to do with CO2 tolerance? What does that have to do with chemoreceptor change? What does that have to do with behavior? We just don't have these answers, and we don't have in the literature, it's almost like we're walking around in the dark. This is how I would describe it. A friend of mine described it like this. We're walking around in a cave with a faulty flashlight. It's really dark, and sometimes we get light on and sometimes it's off, and we just have all of this space that is dark and we don't know yet.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I've heard similar ones. It's like you're trying to, if you're trying to, map the seabed, and all you've got is a pair of diver's goggles, and you're at the surface. You just can't see beyond certain things that are the murk and what have you. Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. So those Instagram ads that I'm getting spammed with saying, if you do this hot breath hold thing and your VO2 max will go up, which they exist. I literally had one of them this morning. I shouldn't bother buying their product.
No, I would focus on
just get out and run.
Yeah, I would focus on aerobic capacity building. Strength and conditioning research will probably get you, over time, a better VO2 max, Martin. And there's very well established evidence in that space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about, over to you, Dylan, any other myths that you have heard over the years that you think, oh no, this is just, no, it might not be that it's wrong, it might just be misplaced. Is there anything else that you think is worth discussing?
I just think we've got to be careful of the taglines, just take a deep breath. We've got to be careful of these bumper sticker taglines that people latch onto, because effectively what it is it's a belief system. And that belief system, if we don't track it back to where it came from, and we don't understand the lens in which those researchers have looked at breathing behavior through, then it can compromise faulty beliefs. It can make them perpetuate themselves. And I do think we've covered most of the things that are worth talking about. But I do just want to come back to this idea that, don't go for the bumper sticker. Think about, how have I already learned to breathe in a specific context? Ask yourself that, because once you start to ask yourself that question, you can start to go, well, why do I breathe that way? What is the belief system that I hold? What is the reason that breathing behavior provides me a solution in that context? And then you can actually start to ask, I think, better questions about why that habit might be in place. And then you can start to learn how to disengage that habit. You can start to learn to replace it with a habit that's more functional, or has an optimal outcome even. And that's the nuance I'd sort of like to present, really, is a different paradigm shift in how we think about it, rather than just bumper sticker breathing behavior.
If there's someone listening to this, and let's imagine a scenario where they need to learn something fast. It's physically demanding. It's cognitively demanding. Difficult task. Similar to the research you've done recently. That sort of environment, and maybe they've got time to prepare for it. They don't have a capnographer. They've read some stuff. What would your advice be for that person in the absence of talking to you directly and getting measured? What's like the simplest experiment someone can do on themselves to see if a certain technique works for them or doesn't work for them? Is there anything that they can go away and actually say, right, I'm going to try something for 10 days, 14 days. If it works, great. If it doesn't, test and adjust, do something else.
Yeah,
is there something they can do?
It's a really great question, and I'm going to answer this the best I can while being a little bit careful, because, as you know,
you are a scientist, Dylan. After all, that's your MO.
The inconvenient truth is that I don't like to do this anymore, where I provide anything that could be interpreted as a technique, because of the reality of what I've discovered, which is that it's so individualized. So let's answer this carefully. I think in any psychophysiological paradigm or any coaching paradigm, we want to start with self-awareness. And the ultimate goal is self-regulation. So in these really difficult environments that we're talking about, where people have to learn rapidly, they have to overcome their own self-regulation challenges, and they have to develop skills that they're applying in these environments. I would focus on, first, what is the skills that you're lacking? and really like hone into them and train them, because that will probably be your force multiplier. If we're talking about self-regulation and the individual struggling with that anxiety that they're experiencing from the performance context, then start with self-awareness and ask yourself, what are the breathing behaviors that are showing up in that performance context? Build that self-awareness first. The next layer up would be self-exploration, which is kind of what you're suggesting, Martin. But I would focus less on techniques and more on, once you have the self-awareness of what you already do, see if you can disengage it and practice something else. And here's an example, and I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but let's say you're in a challenging situation, but you're not under exertion, and you notice that you switch from the nose to the mouth and from belly to chest, right? And you've built a self-awareness of that. One way you could ask yourself is, can I disengage that? Do I need to actually breathe that way in the task that I'm in? Or can I allow myself to drop away from that and practice something different? So we would refer to that as like a negative practice. So can you breathe through the nose? Can you actually allow yourself to drop away from chest breathing or accessory breathing muscles and allow your reflexive breathing to take place, your natural breathing, right? Because there'll be a payoff to that breathing behavior. And I think what will happen is, over time, if you explore it in that way with a critical mind, you will get to a solution yourself. You will find your own solution, as opposed to just taking a technique and applying it and hoping for the best. Because learning is self-exploration. It is about understanding your own responses and then working with that. I don't have your solutions, man. You don't have mine. But we can certainly ask better questions to help people find their own solutions. So it's a challenge. I don't like to give a technique, and I think that we should be trying to get individuals to be building more self-awareness. And that's an inconvenient truth.
It doesn't surprise me, when a lot of it is a lot, the personalization is where the devil is in that detail. Like you have to find the systems that work for you. And often, I kind of think of it like, if you climb an Everest, very few people will climb Everest on their own. No one does. Like, not for the first time. Someone did it for the first time, obviously, once upon a time. But now you hire an expedition leader, because that expedition leader knows the route. They know alternative routes. They know when to step backwards, when to go forwards. And the same kind of thing applies to most aspects of human performance. It's just useful to have somebody there who can steer you and allow you to personalize that route up the mountain. That might be different for different people because of different conditions, different equipment, different experiences. It doesn't surprise me when you say that, because it's so true.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really think that what we should be trying to do better is develop better coaching strategies in these environments and personalize and individualize things in a more effective way. Asking better questions, providing better reflections to the individual who's performing in these really difficult environments, so that they can find their own path.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, again, in the absence of a capnographer or in the absence of that data of actually knowing what is going in and going out in terms of breath by breath analysis, there's certain wearables I have which now tell me my ventilation rate. They'll tell me how many breaths per minute I'm taking, all that kind of stuff. One, is it valid? And two, is it valuable? Or are there any other outcome measures that you think would be valuable? We've talked about some subjective measures, like how it feels. Is there anything else that people might want to use in certain situations that might actually give them some valuable, like that biofeedback that I know you mentioned?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not a fan.
Heart rate variability, for example, is another one we've not really talked about.
Yeah, we can talk about heart rate variability. So to address the wearable question, I wouldn't trust your wearables, especially not from a breathing metric perspective. I think that it will more than likely just lead down a path where you misinterpret things and you potentially just create these false beliefs, and you're not necessarily going to get the outcome you think you're going to get. So I wouldn't trust wearables like that. But that's not to say that wearables can't provide us with some positive outcomes, right? Because biofeedback itself, if we look at the philosophy of biofeedback, it should be there to develop more self-awareness, this introspective understanding of ourselves. And I think if that's done well without the tail wagging the dog, and understanding that even though it's inaccurate, it's consistently inaccurate. And so you can get these trend ranges from wearables. If you have that mindset, I think you can do have some really positive effects from using wearables. But you've got to check yourself, because a lot of people will wake up some days and think, oh man, my HRV's low today. Or, I didn't get the same readiness number that I had yesterday. So that must mean that I'm going to have a bad day today. And I just think all of that is a problem. I think it's a real challenge that people need to make sure that they're not going down that route. So to segue now from that to things like heart rate variability biofeedback. Now, HRV biofeedback is actually one of the interventions that I'm happy to recommend because it has so much evidence behind it. There are some caveats, and we'll talk about that, but HRV biofeedback is effectively when you follow a breathing pacer and you bring your breath rate down to a specified breath rate, a slow breath rate. So think of it like going from normal breathing to like 6 breaths per minute, for example. And this pacer will just pace your inhale and your exhale. And all the researchers looked at how that modulates the autonomic nervous system. They look at the baroreflex as well, for example, which is your blood pressure reflex. And most intervention periods are about 5 to 8 weeks to get the effects of that. And there is lots of evidence out there over the last 5 decades around HRV biofeedback. Recent meta-analyses have even showed things like improvement in sport performance. So they're starting to look at, is there indirect effects as well into sports performance? My only caution, if we come back to the first principles of some of the stuff that we're talking about, is that still is a mechanical breathing technique, which means that just because you practice it doesn't mean that it's optimizing your internal respiration. And if you had a baseline dysfunctional breathing habit that you hadn't identified, HRV biofeedback could actually potentially make that worse. So we do, again, it's caution, right? And I just want people to start thinking about this a little bit more deeply. If I go back to one of the clients we talked about, Martin, the police officer, what we did with that individual was we spent a few weeks identifying those faulty beliefs, and I used educational capnography for them to support that shift in belief system. And then we practiced HRV biofeedback when they could do it regulated from a respiratory perspective. So I was using heart rate and I was using capnography to be able to say, when this person's practicing this breathing intervention and they're going inhale, exhale, from a respiratory perspective, they are regulated. And also we're seeing the autonomic changes that we want to see when we're using the biofeedback. Now, that's how I do it now because of my understanding of where this can lead people astray and where it can go wrong. But it's still an evidence-based intervention. So you could do it without capnography and you're potentially going to get some really positive benefits, but you have to stick to it for 5 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
Can't
Consistency.
Consistency matters. You can't just do it for a week and expect to get these amazing benefits.
Yeah. Again, I think that's one of the things, not to badmouth box breathing. I do, like I've said, it does work for some people in certain environments, but I will often see people just throw it in as I feel stressed, I feel over aroused, so I'm just going to do this breathing technique for like 2 minutes, but they've not practiced it. It's just like thrown in as a last minute, or this is going to help me down regulate in this moment. And I just don't believe it will. I think maybe box breathing might be similar. If you did it consistently for a number of weeks, months even, it might have an effect, but highly unlikely just as a one-off sort of thing.
Yeah, and this is a great point, really. It's like if we have to identify what the effect is, because it might have a really positive effect for an individual, but that doesn't necessarily translate to a performance environment. And some of the research we've done recently, as you know, it's you don't necessarily arrive at the performance location in a physiologically calm state, and you also don't necessarily have 2 minutes to arrive at that performance location and do a conscious intervention, which you're then making the baby step or the step forward to say that that's going to improve your performance. Again, highly individualized. We don't have empirical literature to support that. And I think it's just, as we've seen today, it's very complex. So, to simplify it in that way is convenient, but it's an inconvenient truth, what the physiology and the psychology of breathing behavior really is.
Yeah.
So,
for sure. It just reminds me, I remember, again, we were together. You did an all-out exercise test on an individual. He went for it on the bike, all out, almost to the maximum. And then as he got off the bike, I remember you said to me, you could see he was trying to do a breathing technique to try and regulate, to bring himself back down. He'd learned it. I don't know where he learned it, but he was trying to do something. 10 seconds later, he was out the door throwing up. If you remember,
I do remember.
It didn't work for him at that moment. He was violently ill.
That's right.
Difficult test. I mean, no shame in it. It was a tough test he did. But yeah, it didn't work. It did not work in that environment.
No, and look, I think that's another awesome example of where we can bring in the coaching element, right? Because what we want to know is what was he trying to achieve? Where have you learnt that breathing intervention? And what does that person believe the outcome is that they're going to get from it? Because then we can start to really dial into, does it have the performance effect that we're looking for in that environment? And as you pointed out in that particular one, it didn't achieve what he thought it was achieving.
No. And I mean, whether the sickness had anything to do with the breathing technique, maybe not, but yeah, it definitely didn't allow him to recover as fast as he thought he was going to recover. I guess that was probably he thought it was going to just facilitate recovery. But yeah, I'm guessing. I don't know. But yeah, all interesting stuff. Dylan, I knew this would be a good episode because we've talked tons on this stuff. So we've gone into some weeds.
We have.
We end the episode by lobbing it back to you, giving you the opportunity to close off, giving us something you've not talked about, maybe something you want to reinforce. Before you do that, if people are interested in you, in Render Safe or anything else that you're doing, what's the best way of people reaching out to you or following the work that you're doing?
I'm on LinkedIn, so connect with me on LinkedIn. Render Safe has their own LinkedIn page as well if you want to see what we're doing with the company. And yeah, more than happy to chat about anything to do with HPO and obviously anything to do with breathing. And you've got me. You've hooked me in.
There's very few people that I know that are as passionate about breathing as you are, Dylan. You're definitely my go-to guy when it comes to anything breathing. I always refer back to you first and foremost. As I said, awesome episode. Really enjoyed it. Great conversation. Dylan, over to you. How do you want to wrap this up today?
Do you know what? I would love to just wrap up to say a lot of the people that are listening on this podcast are people that are working in extreme environments and difficult environments. So thank you very much for all the work you do. It's humbling to me. And, coming from that environment, I now want to hopefully support people who are still in that environment. And then the second thing I would say is just be mindful of how our beliefs and what we believe shape our behavior and shape how we approach the world, for good and for bad, and ultimately build more self-awareness of the performance context that you're trying to optimize, because even optimization in itself has a flawed concept a lot of the time. So focus on self-awareness, focus on what skills you actually need to build to perform in that environment, and then consider whether or not breathing might be a limitation or something that's going to enhance your performance in that context.
Awesome. And don't try and climb a mountain in just a pair of shorts. That's how I'd wrap up as well.
Yeah, that's very Kiwi. Well. It's a very Kiwi thing to do, to be honest.
Yeah. They're very short shorts as well. Yeah, maybe that is a Kiwi influence. Awesome. Dylan, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks to Dylan for joining me on the podcast. What this conversation reminded me is that it's incredibly easy to accept simple answers to complex problems. Whether it's box breathing, mouth taping, or the latest technique that's doing the rounds on social media, we really need to question the evidence, understand the context, and be aware that what works for one person might not work for another. Anecdote is not evidence. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow the Optimising Human Performance podcast. Leaving a rating and review really helps us to reach more people. And if you know someone who'd benefit from hearing this conversation, then please share it with them. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Optimising Human Performance podcast.